So with this video, I want to talk a little bit about the immune system and how it's organized, and then get into one of the branches of the immune system just a little bit. If you look at this organizational chart that I have, you'll notice that the immune system has two branches to it. So the first of these is what's known as the innate system. And the reason that it's called the innate system is because it is innate to your body. What I mean by that is it's fully functional from the time of birth. You're born with it, it's fully functional as soon as you're born and you come into this world, and it's helping to keep your body healthy. This is the branch of the immune system that we're going to focus on today. However, you should also know that there's a second branch. It's known as the adaptive system. And the reason that it's known as the adaptive system is because it is not innate to your body. It's not fully functional from the time of birth, but it starts adapting to the microorganisms that are around you from the time of birth and continues that process of adapting to microorganisms that are around you through the entirety of your life. We're going to get into the adaptive system a little bit later, and that's where we're going to spend most of our time in the immune system. However, today we're going to be focused on the innate system, so I want to introduce you to that particular system just a little bit more. If you look at what I've got listed under this flow chart, you'll notice that three different things, three different components of the body are listed as parts of this innate system. The first are external body membranes. So an external body membrane is the skin, for example. And the skin is really good at separating what's inside the body from what's outside the body and keeping those things that are outside the body on the outside where they can't cause you harm. The skin, of course, is intact from the time of birth, and it's playing that role of keeping microorganisms out of the internal parts of your body. So it's a good example of an organ that's a part of this innate system. You'll notice also that I've got listed under this some cells that make up the innate system. The first of these that I just want to mention are phagocytic cells, or phagocytes. These are cells like macrophages, which you've probably heard of if you've taken a biology class before, which have the role of going and defending the body against microorganisms. So they will actually phagocytize or engulf microorganisms that they find and work to break them down and destroy them that way. Natural killer cells are another type of cell that you're born with that's functioning in your body. It's a part of this innate system. These cells you'll have a chance to learn more about in the book. What I want to focus more on for today are some of the chemicals and proteins that are actually produced by the innate system that help to defend your body and keep you healthy. So the first of these are pyrogens. If you break that word down, pyrogen basically means fire generating, fire starting. So these are chemicals that actually increase body temperature. And we've all had a fever before. Fevers are caused by pyrogens. And the reason that we want to increase body temperature if you've actually got an invasion of a microorganism in your body is because increasing body temperature can make it really difficult for microorganisms like bacteria to be able to reproduce. So it can be a really good way to kind of halt the reproduction and therefore halt the progress of a microorganism that has entered the body. These last three things that I've got listed under chemicals and protein, I want to talk about with the next few slides that we have in this lecture. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to our next slide. So the first component, this is actually a protein that's produced by the body that I want to talk about that's a part of the innate system, is a protein which is known as interferon. And interferon is a chemical that's secreted by cells that have been infected by a virus. And to really understand what that means for a cell to be infected by a virus, I probably need to do a little bit of review here on what viruses actually do. So if you've had a microbiology in class in the past, maybe if you've had biology, you've learned about this. If not, just to make sure we're all on the same page, I'm going to go ahead and draw in what viruses do. So I have my little representation of a cell here, and I'm going to draw in my little representation of a virus. So I remember being in freshman biology in college and seeing an actual picture of a virus for the first time and thinking they were so weird looking because they looked like little lunar landing modules. They've got this little triangular kind of shaped capsule here and then these little legs that come off of them that attach them to cells of our bodies. And what these viruses are effectively are capsules that are filled with DNA on the inside, or RNA if we happen to have a retrovirus. So I just drew in green my representation of DNA that's carried within this virus. And what happens with viruses is once they attach themselves to our cells, they actually puncture a hole in the cell. So there's my little drawing trying to represent that a hole has been punctured in that cell. And then the virus inserts its DNA into your cell so that now viral DNA is sitting in your cell. You guys learned, I'm sure, before in a biology class that in the center, usually, of our cells, we've got an area which is known as the nucleus. And the nucleus is a place where your own DNA is housed. So I'm going to draw here my representation of DNA that's in your nucleus. Well, what happens when this viral DNA gets introduced into the body is it goes into the nucleus and it actually inserts itself, it attaches itself to your DNA. So I'm going to draw my representation of that here. And then when your nucleus is reading your DNA and from that producing proteins, it's going to read viral DNA and it's going to start producing viral proteins. And what happens at that point is your cell becomes a virus factory and it starts producing all of these little viruses inside of it. And you have lots and lots of virus building up inside of your cell. And eventually you have hundreds, maybe even thousands of virus that have been produced by your own cell, and the cell fills up with virus and that causes the cell to burst, which is also known as lysis. So the cell lyses or it bursts and releases these viruses out into your body. And then of course, you've got other cells that are nearby the cell that was infected. And what all these little baby viruses are going to do is go out and attach themselves to other cells of yours and insert their genetic information into those cells, take over the cells, cause them to become a virus factory as well. So when you have a virus-infected cell, what that means is the cell has been taken over by a virus and it is producing lots and lots of virus that it's soon going to be releasing out into the body. So a cell that's been taken over by a virus, like this cell that we drew here, is what's going to produce interferon. And interferon cannot help the cell that has been infected. It's too late for that cell. But what interferon does is it travels to other nearby cells. So these cells that are close to our cell that's infected, and it shuts down protein synthesis in these cells. What that means is these nearby cells stop reading their DNA and they stop producing proteins from it. That's going to prevent these cells from becoming virus factories because if they're not reading their own DNA, they're not going to be reading viral DNA and producing virus. The other thing that interferon will do is it will break down viral genetic information. So it will actually break down the DNA, for example, of the virus so that it's not able to get into other cells and cause problems. So that's interferon. Interferon works specifically against viruses. So it's only released if you have an infection in your body involving a virus. If you have an infection with a bacterium or a fungi or some other type of microorganism, interferon does not get involved because it will not help in those cases because bacteria reproduce through a different way. So another antimicrobial protein that I want to talk about that's a part of this innate system is what's known as the complement system. And the complement system is referred to as a system because it involves a whole bunch of proteins in the body. It's not just one, like we saw previously with interferon. So the complement system includes at least 20 proteins that we know of. These proteins are found in the plasma, so they're floating around in the blood. These proteins have names, so we've got plasma proteins C1, C2, C3, all the way up to C9. We also have others that are named factors BDP, and there are still others as well. You're going to have a chance in the activity that you do this week to work with the complement system and learn how it's actually activated and learn the names of some of these plasma proteins that are involved in it. So I'm going to save excuse me, the discussion of how the complement system actually works for that particular activity. However, I want you to know what complement activation does. So when the complement system becomes aware that we have a microorganism that has infected the body, there's a couple of things that's going to happen. First of all, we're going to get a rev up in inflammation in the body. So believe it or not, inflammation, even though we don't like it because it hurts, and a lot of times we try to fight against it, right, by using ice and compression and those kinds of things to really kind of decrease it, inflammation is actually really important to healing in the body. And without inflammation, you would never be able to heal. So complement actually revs up inflammation. And we'll talk about the ways in which inflammation is going to help the healing process with our next couple of slides following this. The other thing that the complement system does is it actually leads to death of antigenic cells. So an antigen is something in the body that's harmful, that's foreign. An antigenic cell would be something like a bacterium. And what they do is they actually lyse that cell. So I talked a little bit about lysis previously. I'm going to draw another cell in here. You can assume this is Streptococcus bacterium or some other antigenic, again, meaning harmful and foreign substance cell that has entered the body. And what the complement system is going to do, believe it or not, is these proteins are going to create a spiky structure. So they manufacture this spiky structure in your body, believe it or not, and then they use that spiky structure to puncture a hole in the cell membrane or the plasma membrane, and that causes the cell to burst, which is what lysis is, and to basically spill all of its cellular guts out, if you will. So it's going to destroy the cell. Because of the way that complement works, because it's going to act by producing this pokey structure, complement cannot work against viruses because they aren't cells, they don't have a plasma membrane that can be punctured. So I talked about previously interferon being specifically for viruses. Complement is specifically for bacteria and other cellular antigens that can be lysed because they have a plasma membrane or a cell membrane. So with the last two slides, what I want to do is talk just a little bit about inflammation. It is a last component of this innate system. So it's functional, it's a part of our bodies from the time of birth. And as I started to talk about with the last slide, it really is important to healing in the body, to healing tissues that have been injured or damaged in some way, and helping to keep us healthy. So I want to use this slide to talk just a little bit about what inflammation is and how it becomes activated in the body, and also why it's important actually to healing and why we wouldn't be able to heal without it. We see inflammation anytime there is tissue injury. So this could be tissue injury that's due to an infectious substance. This could be tissue injury that's due to a dog bite. It could be tissue injury that's due to ligaments because you rolled your ankle. Anytime you have tissue injury, the tissues that have been damaged start to release inflammatory chemicals. So there are a whole bunch of different inflammatory chemicals, cytokines and interleukins and all sorts of different inflammatory chemicals that you can read about in the book. I want you to take away from this class a knowledge of histamine. It's the primary inflammatory chemical. So when we say inflammatory chemicals, we're talking about a whole host of things, but for the sake of this class, if you know histamine and that it's the primary inflammatory chemical, and then when it's released by damaged tissues, it causes inflammation, that's going to be great for the purpose of this class. When histamine gets released, it's going to have a couple of effects. The first is histamine causes capillaries to dilate. And of course, if capillaries dilate, if they open up, if they become wider, that's going to allow an increase in the amount of blood that's able to travel through those capillaries. So when capillaries dilate in an area where histamine has been released due to tissue damage, we're going to get an influx of blood into that area. And that's what a damaged tissue needs. It needs more blood, bringing the oxygen that blood has and the nutrients that blood has to help those tissues that have been damaged to heal. One of the things that you'll see associated with inflammation, so kind of a hallmark of inflammation, is redness in the area that has been damaged. And what you're actually seeing with that redness is the increased blood flow to the tissues that are there due to the dilation of the capillaries. The other thing that's going to happen anytime we have damaged tissues and we get histamine released is the capillaries in the area where histamine is being released are going to become more permeable. So they are going to become more leaky. And what that means is, in addition to this increase in blood flow, we are going to have an increase in oxygen and nutrients as well as fluids leaking from the bloodstream into those tissues. So another thing that you commonly see with inflammation is swelling in tissues, and what you're actually seeing when a tissue swells is fluid that's leaking from the blood, that's leaking from these capillaries that have become more permeable. This is important for a few different reasons. If we are making the blood vessels more permeable, it's easier for the things that are needed to get to the damaged site. So oxygen and nutrients are able to diffuse out and get there. But also, when we've got tissue damage, a lot of times we need macrophages and white blood cells coming into the area. And the capillaries actually become permeable enough to allow blood cells to move into the area, white blood cells specifically, so that they can start cleaning up the tissue damage and working on healing. Another reason that the swelling actually is important is a lot of times when you have tissue damage, you have a toxin or a poison that also gets injected. So if you think about a snake bite from a poisonous snake, or a spider bite from a venomous spider, you have swelling associated with those things, and one of the things that the increased fluid in the area does is it helps to dilute the toxin so that the toxin doesn't have the same effects on you as it otherwise would. However, when you have swelling, when you have fluid that's building up in a tissue, that fluid puts pressure on nerve endings, and that hurts. And that's why inflammation hurts, because you've got the swelling that's going on that's putting pressure on nerve endings, and you're feeling that. And that's, again, why a lot of times we like to try to limit inflammation, because it hurts, we don't like it, so we sprain our ankle, and we limit that inflammation and that swelling so that it's not as painful. So with this last slide, what I want to do is kind of talk about what happens on a cellular level once histamine gets released into the body. And basically, what we want to see happening is this increase in blood flow that's going to get more blood and all of its good stuff coming into the area, and then an increase in a permeability of the blood vessels so that, as I mentioned before, we can get white blood cells moving into the area that has been damaged. So if you look at this slide here, we've got a section of somebody's skin, we've got a puncture wound with a nail or something that has embedded itself into their skin. This is trying to show that maybe there was some type of bacterium that was on the nail that got introduced as well. So you can see these little rod-shaped bacteria that have been introduced and are represented in purple. So we've got damaged tissue along with introduction of a microorganism. The damaged tissue is going to start to release histamine, as I talked about previously. And one of the things that histamine does is it makes it so that white blood cells come into the area, because remember, white blood cells are our immune system cells. They include the macrophages that can come in here and start working to engulf these little rod-shaped bacteria and destroy them, and also start working to break down tissues that have been damaged and died. So there's a 4-step process to get white blood cells and macrophages to an area that has been damaged. The first step is what's known as leukocytosis. So our blood cells, as you learned about earlier, are produced in the bone marrow. And we actually have a lot of white blood cells in particular that are stored in the bone marrow and are brought out when they're needed, so brought out when there's infection in the body. When we have inflammation going on, the inflammatory chemicals tell a large number of those white blood cells that have been stored in the bone marrow to leave the bone marrow and migrate into the blood. And that's a process which is known as leukocytosis. So sometimes with inflammation, with an infection, you'll see a 5-fold increase in the number of white blood cells that are in the bloodstream in just a few hours, because they're actively being called out of the bone marrow and into the blood. If you look down here, so you've got this artist's representation of a blood vessel. There's a little white blood cell in purple in here, and we're moving through the bloodstream, this white blood cell is, and we're approaching the area of inflammation and damage, and that's where the second step in this process happens. So the second step is what's known as margination, and what happens here is our capillary widens, and that actually slows down the blood flow through this capillary. So remember, it dilated and it became more permeable. So our blood flow is starting to slow down through this area where we've dilated. You'll notice this white blood cell is kind of starting to sprout some structures on it. So these structures that it's starting to sprout allow it to take hold of the blood vessel wall, which you can see happening right here. So this white blood cell has attached itself to the blood vessel wall. Once it's attached itself, the next step in the process happens. The next step is what's known as diapetesis, and if you break that term down, it basically means the condition of walking through. So here is a white blood cell that's going through diapetesis, and basically what diapetesis is it's squeezing itself through the wall of that capillary. So it's leaving the bloodstream, squeezing itself through the wall of the capillary, and actually going into the tissue where we have the damage. So diapetesis, or walking through, because it's basically walking through that blood vessel wall. The last step in this process is what's known as positive chemotaxis. So remember, these tissues that have been damaged, they're releasing inflammatory chemicals, primarily histamine, and this white blood cell is going to home in on where we have high levels of those inflammatory chemicals and start making its way towards that area so it can start to engulf these bacteria and help to clean up the damaged and the dead tissues that are here.